In 1968, the colony of Spanish Guinea was granted independence and became the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. In its first open election, which turned out to be its last, it elected as president Francisco Macías Nguema. He very quickly turned out to be a dictator. However, he wasn't just a dictator. He became one of the worst dictators of the 20th century. Learn more about Francisco Macías Nguema, his reign of terror, and how he single-handedly wrecked Equatorial Guinea on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by Fiji Water. You've probably heard of Fiji Water and have seen it in stores. Well, Fiji Water really is from the islands of Fiji. Drop by drop, Fiji water is filtered through volcanic rock, 1,600 miles away from the nearest continent and all its pollution, protected and preserved naturally from external elements. In this process, it collects a unique profile of electrolytes and minerals, resulting in more than double the electrolytes as the other top two premium bottled water brands, giving Fiji water its smooth taste. Fiji water's electrolytes are 100% natural, and this water even has a perfectly balanced pH of 7.7. I've recently been trying to reduce my consumption of diet soda, and I found Fiji water to be a great alternative. Visit your local retailer to pick up some Fiji water today for your next backyard party, beach day, hike, or even your home office. Fiji water is Earth's finest water. This episode is sponsored by Mint Mobile. According to recent data, approximately 98% of all Americans own a mobile phone. And that means a monthly phone bill is something that almost all of us share. With all the bills you have to pay, why pay more than you have to for your phone bill? With Mint Mobile, you can start with plans as low as $15 per month. And with Mint Mobile, you can keep your phone, your number, and use the same towers and networks that you do now. All you do is save money. And that's why I recommend Mint Mobile. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/EED. That's mintmobile.com/EED. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabits on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. What do you think of when I say the names Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao Zedong, Idi Amin, Saddam Hussein, or Kim Il-sung? You probably think of some of the world's worst dictators, horrible people who did horrible things. Yet there's someone else that you should think of when you think of the worst world leaders of the 20th century, Francisco Macías Nguema. There's a good chance that you've never heard of him before. But by the end of this episode, hopefully you'll see that he has earned a well-deserved place amongst the worst leaders in history. The reason why you may not have heard of him before is that Equatorial Guinea is a really small country that doesn't get much attention. Before I get into the man who called himself Macías, first a bit about Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea was a former colony of Spain known as Spanish Guinea. The country is small and has 2 geographically separated parts: the mainland region, known as Rio Mundi, and several islands in the Gulf of Guinea, the largest of which is Bioko, and is home to the capital, Malabo. It is the only country in Africa that speaks Spanish. It's bordered by Cameroon to the north and by Gabon to the south and east. As with most African colonies, independence movements developed after World War II. Spain granted the colony autonomy in 1963, and it became independent on October 12, 1968. Francisco Macías Nguema was born in 1924 in Rio Mundi. He was a member of the Fang ethnic group, which was the dominant ethnic group on the mainland. His early life was marked by limited formal education, reaching only the elementary level before working various jobs, including as a court interpreter and later as a coffee plantation administrator. He increasingly benefited from the colonial administration's advancement, rising from a court clerk and interpreter to mayor of Mongomo, and by 1964, deputy prime minister of the autonomous government, positions that poised him to seize power at independence. Macías founded the Idea Popular de la Guinea Equatorial, or IPGE, positioning himself as a champion of Fang interests and rural populations. His political strategy was shrewd, recognizing that the Fang constituted about 85% of the population and had been somewhat marginalized by Spanish colonial policies that favored the more urbanized and educated populations on Bioko. The crucial moment came during the 1968 Constitutional Convention and subsequent elections. Spain had hoped that more moderate educated leaders would emerge to lead the new nation. However, Macías skillfully exploited ethnic tensions and rural-urban divides. He campaigned as an authentic African leader who would restore traditional values and protect Fang culture from foreign influence. His opponents, including Bonifacio Ondo Idu, were portrayed as tools of Spanish neocolonialism despite their superior education and administrative experience. The 1968 presidential election was remarkably close, requiring a runoff between Macías and Ondo Idu. Macías won by appealing to ethnic solidarity and promising to expel foreign influence, including Spanish settlers and businessmen. His victory speech ominously declared that he would build a nation, quote, for Africans by Africans, which many interpreted as a threat to the substantial Spanish population and other minorities. Independence came on October 12, 1968, with Macías as the first president. Initially, there were hopes that democratic institutions would take root. The new constitution included provisions for civil liberties, separation of powers, and regular elections. The transformation from elected president to dictator accelerated rapidly between 1969 and 1972. Macías began concentrating power in his hands, dismissing competent civil servants and replacing them with loyal but unqualified supporters, primarily from his own ethnic group and region. He declared states of emergency to justify suspending constitutional rights and then extended these indefinitely. Opposition figures were arrested, tortured, or executed. Ethnic Bubi leaders and intellectuals were disproportionately targeted, especially on Bioko Island. One of his first orders of business was creating the Juventud en Marcha con Macías, or JMM. It was modeled loosely on fascist and revolutionary youth movements like the Hitler Youth or Mao's Red Guards, and it played a central role in consolidating his regime and enforcing loyalty through terror, indoctrination, and violence. Ondo Idu fled the country but was extradited to Equatorial Guinea by Spain. He was arrested, tortured, and either executed or committed suicide in March of 1969. 1969 also saw the expulsion of Spanish personnel and the closure of institutions. Spanish missionaries, educators, and medical professionals were expelled. Western-style education, media, and religious institutions began to be dismantled. The Catholic Church lost its protection, and churches were increasingly harassed. On Christmas Eve, 150 of his opponents were brought to the National Stadium and executed on the grounds of allegedly plotting a coup. They were killed while the song "Those Were the Days" by Mary Hopkin were playing on the stadium sound system. And now that you know that, you will never listen to that song the same way again. Macías started referring to himself in grandiose titles and demanded portraits of himself in public places. Some of the titles he gave himself included the Unique Miracle, Grand Master of Education, Science, and Culture, Master of all the Powers of the Revolution, Father of the Nation, Immortal, and Invincible. What little press and radio there was now became tools of state propaganda. In 1970, with most of his adversaries now gone, he established the Partido Único Nacional de los Trabajadores, or PUNT, which was declared the only legal political party. All other parties were banned or forcibly merged into PUNT. Loyalty to the party became equated with loyalty to the president. In 1971, Decree 415 was issued. This decree gave the president complete control over all branches of government. It removed any pretense of institutional checks and concentrated all executive, legislative, and judicial powers in Macías's hands. Later that year, Law 1 was passed, which criminalized dissent. Under this law, criticizing the president became punishable by decades in prison or death. Even private comments or jokes were ground for arrest. Later that year, he began to see education as a threat to his rule. He abolished private education, burned books, banned the use of the word intellectual, and closed libraries and schools. Wearing glasses or reading foreign books was viewed with suspicion, and members of the intelligentsia were purged or exiled. He famously declared that education was unnecessary and that Equatorial Guineans should return to traditional ways of life under his guidance. In 1972, he finally declared himself president for life. A 1973 referendum officially approved the regime with a vote reportedly showing 99.9% approval, which was, of course, a totally legit election. Economically, Equatorial Guinea under Macías was a disaster. Spanish businesses and plantations, which had formed the backbone of the economy, were confiscated or abandoned as their owners fled the country. The coca industry, which had provided most export revenue, collapsed as skilled managers and workers left. Macías replaced technical expertise with political loyalty, leading to the breakdown of infrastructure, telecommunications, and basic services. Under his regime, repression and terror became the norm. Entire villages vanished, mass arrests and executions were routine, and political, ethnic, and intellectual opponents, especially amongst the Bubi minority, were mercilessly targeted. Estimates suggest that between 20 and 80,000 people were either killed or forced into exile, representing up to 1/3 of Equatorial Guinea's entire population. Initially, some African leaders viewed him sympathetically as an authentic African nationalist standing against neo-colonial influence. However, as reports of atrocities mounted and refugees flooded neighboring countries, international opinion turned decisively against him. Spain, despite its colonial history, found itself hosting thousands of Equatorial Guinean refugees and became a center of opposition to the Macías regime. Not surprisingly, Macías aligned with Eastern Bloc nations, drawing support from the Soviet Union, Cuba, and North Korea, while severing ties with Spain and the West. His paranoia began to extend to his own family. Everyone had to walk on eggshells around him, constantly showing their support and never doing anything which could be considered a threat to him or his regime. By the late 1970s, Equatorial Guinea had become a failed state. The economy had collapsed entirely, with no functioning currency, infrastructure, or institutions. The population had declined dramatically through death and immigration. Even Macías's own supporters began to recognize that his rule threatened the nation's very survival. The end came through a family coup in August of 1979. Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mambasago, Macías's nephew and head of the National Guard, led a military uprising that quickly succeeded. The irony was thick. The man who had destroyed so many families through suspicion and paranoia was ultimately brought down by his own nephew, who he had trusted with military command. The fall was swift and decisive. Macías attempted to flee but was captured trying to escape with a large sum of money, which he eventually ended up burning out of spite. His trial became a moment of reckoning for the nation, as survivors testified about the horrors that they had endured. The proceedings revealed the full extent of his crimes against his own people, documenting systematic torture, mass murder, and the deliberate destruction of the nation's social fabric. Macías was executed by firing squad in September of 1979, ending 11 years of rule that had transformed a relatively prosperous small nation into a devastated wasteland. His death marked not just the end of a dictatorship, but the conclusion of one of Africa's most destructive post-independence governments. The new president of Equatorial Guinea became Teodoro Obiang, Macías's nephew. Initially, Obiang's takeover was welcomed both domestically and internationally. After 11 years of Francisco Macías's reign of terror, almost any change seemed positive. The early years of Obiang's rule, from 1979 to the late 80s, were marked with efforts to rebuild basic state institutions and restore some semblance of normal life. The new government reopened schools, attempted to restart the collapsed coca industry, and encouraged some refugees to return. Spain and other international partners provided assistance, hoping to help stabilize the country after the devastation of the previous decade. However, it became clear relatively quickly that while Obiang represented a departure from his uncle's extreme brutality, he had no intention of establishing genuine democratic governance. The discovery of oil in the 1990s changed the economic fortunes of the country. The oil wealth had profound implications for Obiang's rule. On one hand, it provided resources to improve infrastructure and living standards for some segments of the population. The capital city of Malabo was rebuilt with modern buildings, roads, and facilities. On the other hand, the concentration of oil revenues into government hands strengthened authoritarian tendencies by reducing dependence on taxation and popular consent. Obiang has amassed a fortune estimated at around $600 million, with money located in banks around the world. He's also adopted some of the megalomaniac habits of his uncle. He's developed his own cult of personality. In 2003, state radio claimed that he is like God in heaven, quote, who has all the power over men and things, and that, quote, he can decide to kill without anyone calling him into account and without going to hell, because it is God himself with whom he is in permanent contract and who gives him this strength, end quote. A series of sham elections have been held over the years, with Obiang receiving between 90 to 100% of the vote every time. 46 years after the downfall of Macías, Obiang is still the president of Equatorial Guinea today and is the longest-serving non-monarch head of state in the world. Now 83 years old, his son is currently scheduled to succeed him. Many African countries have suffered from dictators or autocrats since achieving independence. However, few have suffered like Equatorial Guinea, which has experienced literally nothing else. By selecting the wrong leader in their only fair election, they went down a path that almost destroyed the country and led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Austin Oetken and Cameron Kieffer. My big thanks go to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon. Your support helps make this podcast possible. And I also want to remind everyone about the community groups on Facebook and Discord. That's where everything happens that's outside the podcast, and links to those are available in the show notes. As always, if you leave a review on any major podcast app or in the above community groups, you too can have it read on the show.